Caelan stood inside the mountain temple, and the air was cold enough to make every breath visible. The walls around him were carved with thousands of names, layered across centuries, the kind of detail that took generations of patient hands to complete. Before him sat 12 stone wolves, each larger than a grown man standing upright, carved from the mountain's own living rock and kept, according to legend, by something older than carving. Every king before him had stood in this exact place and watched these guardians bow. Caelan stood now and watched them do nothing. Not a flicker, not a shift of stone. The 12 wolves remained exactly as they had for 500 years, facing him with the particular stillness of judgment withheld. Behind him, the council had gathered to witness, and he could hear their breathing change as the silence extended past the point where silence could be explained as ceremony. A priest near the back said, in a voice meant to carry, "The trial has rejected him." Another voice, lower, answered, "Because he came without a true Luna." Lord Theric said nothing. He did not need to. His expression carried the satisfaction of a man watching a problem solve itself in exactly the direction he had engineered. Outside the temple, beyond the sealed stone gate, Eira stood in the snow. She had been standing there since dawn, in the pale cloak that marked her as Luna, and nothing else. No clan colors, no bloodline crest, nothing that would have told an observer where she came from. Because there was nothing to tell. Snow gathered in her hair. The nobles near her had arranged themselves at a small but unmistakable distance. The kind of distance people keep from something they have decided, collectively and without discussion, to treat as bad luck. She did not look at them. She looked at the gate. She understood, the way she had understood many things in her life without anyone explaining them to her, that something had gone wrong inside, and that the wrongness was connected to her absence. She turned to leave. Before her foot left the temple steps, she reached back and touched the stone gate. Just her palm, just for a moment, the entire mountain shook. Not an earthquake. Something more deliberate, more aimed. The way a struck bell shakes with purpose rather than accident. Inside the temple, the 12 stone wolves lowered their heads at once, so suddenly and with such weight that dust fell from the ceiling in a fine gray rain. Caelan stared at them. He had spent his entire life being told what this moment would look like, and none of the telling had prepared him to watch it happen toward an empty doorway rather than toward himself. Outside, Eira heard it. Stone scraping against stone, deep beneath the mountain, the sound of something enormous adjusting its posture after 500 years of stillness. Then a voice spoke, ancient and slow, carrying through solid rock, as though the rock itself had simply decided to stop being an obstacle. The king entered alone. A pause long enough that Eira's heartbeat filled it. But the oath has found its keeper. Eira went very still. She had never heard that word applied to herself. Keeper, she did not know what it meant. She only knew, with the specific certainty that arrives, without explanation, that her life had just changed in a way she could not yet measure. That morning, before any of this, Lord Theric had come to Caelan's chambers, with the particular calm of a man delivering bad news he has. Rehearsed enough times to make it sound reasonable. He said the council had concerns about Eira's bloodline. He said no one in 5 generations had entered the Stone Wolf trial with a Luna whose clan could not be traced, verified, or named. He said the trial was sacred precisely because it tested bloodline legitimacy, and an unknown bloodline standing beside the king risked poisoning the entire ceremony. He said this with the specific gentleness reserved for delivering threats disguised as concern. Caelan had argued, He had said Eira was his Luna regardless of her bloodline, that the temple priestesses who raised her were respected throughout the mountain. That her character had never given anyone reason for suspicion. Theric had said character was not the question. Legitimacy was the question, and if the clans withdrew their support before the trial even began, there would be no kingdom left for either of them to rule, legitimate or otherwise. Caelan had gone to find Eira with that argument still echoing in his skulls, already half convinced and hating himself for it. He found her in the temple garden, where she often sat among the prayer flags the orphan children tied for wolves who had no families to remember them. He told her she could not enter the temple with him. He said it would only be until the trial concluded. He said he would explain everything afterward, that this was a temporary necessity rather than a judgment on her worth. Eira looked at him for a long moment. She said, "And if the trial asks why you left your Luna at the gate?" He had no answer. He had spent the rest of the morning preparing one and had still not found it by the time they reached the temple steps. At the gate, the formal procession assembled. Nobles in their clan colors, each house represented, each bloodline visible in the particular weave and dye that marked 500 years of careful intermarriage and inheritance. Caelan walked toward the entrance. Eira remained at the base of the steps. High Priestess Malin, who had raised Eira from infancy within the temple walls, lowered her eyes as Caelan passed, unable to watch directly what was about to happen. Lady Saren, dressed in the deep crimson of her clan house, watched from the noble side with an expression Eira could not quite read. Not unkindness exactly, but the careful neutrality of someone who has been told a story and has not yet decided whether to believe it. Isa said nothing as Caelan reached the doors. He paused. He looked back at her once. She held his gaze. Then she said quietly, but clearly enough for those nearest her to hear, "Then may the stones remember what blood has forgotten." Caelan turned and walked through the temple doors. They closed behind him with the specific finality of stone meeting stone. Eira stood in the snow and waited, because waiting was the only thing currently available to her. Inside, Caelan approached the 12 stone wolves, with his heart working harder than the walk should have required. He had rehearsed this moment for years, the formal address, the recitation of his bloodline back through 6 generations, the specific posture of humility that preceded the guardian's bow. He spoke the words. He recited the lineage. He stood in the posture. Nothing happened. The stone wolves remained exactly as they had been when he entered. 12 carved faces regarding him with the particular weight of something. Ancient declining to be moved. Theric, standing at the rear of the witnessing council, said the word everyone had been avoiding. "Omen," he said. Eira's unverified bloodline had followed Caelan into the sacred chamber, despite her physical absence, that her clanless nature had somehow contaminated the trial from outside the walls. It was not a logical claim. It did not need to be logical to spread through a frightened room. Caelan stood before the unmoving wolves and began, for the first time, to understand that he might actually lose everything. The crown, the mountain, the kingdom his father had died trying to hold together because of a decision he had made that morning, believing it was necessary. Then the floor moved, not violently. A deep, settling vibration, the kind that precedes something large choosing to act, rather than something large failing to remain still. The 12 stone wolves lowered their heads simultaneously with enough force that the dust of 5 centuries fell from the carved ceiling above them. They were not bowing toward Caelan. Their heads were turned, as much as carved stone could be said to turn, toward the sealed doors behind him. toward the gate, toward the woman he had left outside it. Caelan was the first one through the doors when they finally opened, moving faster than dignity strictly permitted for a king mid-trial. He found Eira exactly where he had left her, except the gate behind her now carried a hairline crack of silver light running through ancient stone that had not been cracked an hour earlier. He said her name. He said she needed to come inside, that the trial required her presence now, that whatever had happened meant the ceremony could continue if she simply stepped through the doors. Eira looked at him. She said, "You left me outside when you thought I would cost you the crown." She let that settle. "You do not get to bring me in only because I may save it." Caelan stood with his hand half extended, the gesture of a man who had expected forgiveness to be simpler than this. He withdrew his hand. He did not argue, because he understood, even as the realization arrived too late to be useful, that she was entirely correct. Behind the cracked gate, deep in the mountain's foundation, a voice spoke again. The same ancient register that had named her keeper. It said, "Keeper of the first den, why do you stand outside your own door?" Eira had never heard those words. She had no memory of any den, first or otherwise. She had been an orphan found on temple steps, raised on prayer and discipline, and the quiet companionship of priestesses who loved her without ever fully explaining where she came from. She looked at the crack of silver light spreading slowly across the gate's surface. She did not know what was being asked of her. She only knew, with the specific clarity that sometimes arrives at the worst possible moments, that her life until this point had been the smallest fraction of a much larger story. High Priestess Caelan found Eira that evening in the small room she had grown up in, the one with the narrow window facing the eastern cliffs. Caelan carried something wrapped in faded cloth. She set it on the table between them without immediately unwrapping it. She said she had kept this for 25 years, uncertain whether keeping it had been wisdom or cowardice. She unwrapped it. Inside was a small swath of fabric, ancient enough that its original color could only be guessed at, marked with a symbol Eira recognized immediately because she had seen it that very day, glowing faintly silver across the surface of the temple gate. "This is what you were wrapped in," Caelan said. "When you were found on the steps." Eira touched the symbol. It felt warm, the way stone feels warm after holding sunlight long after the sun has gone. Caelan said, "We called you orphan because we were afraid to say the mountain had claimed you before any clan could." She said it quietly, the specific quiet of a confession that has waited a long time to be spoken. Eira looked at her. "You knew," she said. "I suspected," Caelan said. "I was afraid of what suspecting out loud would cost both of us." Eira held the cloth and said nothing for a long moment. She was not angry. She recognized the fear too well to be angry about it. She had spent her whole life being careful about which parts of herself she let anyone see. Lord Theric moved quickly once the gate's reaction became impossible to deny. He declared, before the full council, that Eira's effect on the stone wolves proved exactly the danger he had warned against, that an unverified bloodline had somehow awakened forbidden magic within the sacred trial, magic that no clan-traced Luna in 500 years had ever displayed. He demanded she be confined within temple walls until the council determined what she actually was. Caelan, present at the council session, hesitated before responding. It was only a moment, but Eira, standing at the edge of the chamber, saw it. She had seen that same hesitation at the temple gate that morning, the specific pause of a man calculating political cost before defending the person he claimed to love. It hurt in the same place it had hurt before. Before Caelan could answer at all. A sound moved through the council chamber floor. The particular grinding settle of mountain stone, deciding to participate in a conversation it had not been invited to. The oldest of the 12 stone wolves, the one the temple records called Archon, spoke from somewhere beneath the chamber, his voice carrying through rock as though rock were simply a less convenient form of air. Blood remembers lineage, a pause that filled the entire room. Stone remembers shelter. The council chamber went silent. Then, along the far wall, a section of stone that had appeared solid, for as long as anyone present could remember, slid open, revealing a passage descending into darkness beneath the temple's foundation. No one else could hear what Eira heard coming from that passage. She could hear it clearly, something like a heartbeat, something like an invitation. She walked toward it before the council could decide whether to stop her. The passage descended further than the temple's visible structure suggested it should, curving downward through rock that grew warmer rather than colder as she walked, as though she were moving toward something living rather than away from the surface world. She emerged into a chamber she had never known existed, carved with images entirely different from the formal lineage walls above. She thought, briefly and without meaning to, of her own childhood in the temple above, sweeping these same kinds of stone floors as a girl, memorizing prayers whose meaning she had never fully been taught, comforting orphan pups brought to the temple steps in the dead of winter because no one else would take them. She had mended prayer flags for wolves with no clan to remember them. She had kept, without ever telling anyone, her own quiet list of nameless children denied pack names by clans who decided their bloodline was not worth the paperwork. She had never known why the mountain felt like home, rather than like the place that had simply taken her in. Standing in this chamber, she began to understand. These were not noble warriors in clan armor. These were orphan pups curled together for warmth, exiled mothers with infants wrapped against the cold, injured wolves being tended by hands that bore no clan markings, foundlings, healers, clanless mates, all gathered around a single central fire carved into the rock with a kind of detail that suggested the carver had loved every figure individually. This was the first den. Eira walked the length of the chamber slowly, reading the images the way she had once read prayer flag inscriptions as a child, piecing together a story no one had ever told her in words. The first pack had not been built from bloodline. It had been built from exactly the kind of people the current law considered unworthy of trial voice. The orphaned, the abandoned, the clanless, the ones gathered in from the cold because someone, somewhere, had decided that shelter mattered more than inheritance. At the chamber's center stood an archive of stones, each carved with a name, hundreds of them, stretching back further than any clan record Eira had ever been shown. She understood, standing among them, what she was. Not a replacement for Caelan, not a rival claim to the throne. The last keeper of an oath the noble clans had buried so thoroughly that even the priestesses who raised her had only suspected fragments of the truth. The stone wolves had not bowed because she carried bloodline. They had bowed because she carried memory, the specific, irreplaceable memory of what the mountain's authority had actually been built upon, before noble houses rewrote the story to put themselves at its center. Caelan, who had followed her down despite the council's objections, stood at the chamber entrance and said nothing for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the particular weight of someone recalculating everything he had believed about his own legitimacy. "I did not leave a bad omen outside the gate," he said. "I left the mountain's memory standing in the snow. Theric moved against the truth as soon as he understood its scope. He ordered the passage to the first den sealed, framing the order to the council as protection against contamination of sacred space by clanless magic. What he actually feared and said privately to his closest allies was that if the first den's history became public, every orphan and foundling currently denied clan name and trial voice would have grounds to demand both. The structure he had spent his life maintaining would not survive that demand intact. Eira, working with records Caelan helped her locate in the temple's older archives, found something that confirmed exactly what she feared. Lists of children denied clan names over the past several generations, some sent into anonymous service positions with no path to advancement. Some who simply vanished from record entirely, their fates undocumented because undocumented children created no inconvenient questions. Some who died as border wolves, without families, without burial rites, because no clan would claim the cost of their funeral rites. She realized her own story was not unusual. It was simply the one that happened to intersect, by circumstance of marriage, with enough power to make it visible. She was not an exception proving the law's fairness. She was a door that the law had been built specifically to keep closed. Caelan came to her that night, alone, without guards or formal procession. He said he had been afraid. He said the council's pressure had felt, in the moment, like the only path that preserved any version of the kingdom worth ruling. He said he understood now how badly he had misjudged the cost. Eira listened to all of it. When he finished, she said, "You were afraid before witnesses." She let that land. Do not apologize in shadows for a gate you closed in public. He absorbed this the way he had absorbed her words at the temple gate, without argument, because argument was not available to him. He left without asking her to forgive him, which she noted was, at minimum, an improvement over the morning he had left her in the snow. 3 nights later, Theric's patience for legal maneuvering ran out entirely. Clan blades found Eira in the lower temple tunnels, where she had gone to retrieve additional First Den records before Theric's order to seal. The passage could be fully enforced. She was not alone. A foundling child, perhaps 7 years old, had followed her into the tunnels out of curiosity and fear of the dark above. When the blades came, Eira placed herself between them and the child without calculating the cost first. The stone wolves, dormant since the trial, woke fully for the first time in 500 years and moved through solid rock to reach her, but not quickly enough to prevent the cut along her shoulder that left blood on the same tunnel steps where she had once waited outside in snow. Caelan arrived moments after the wolves had driven off Theric's men. He found her pressing a hand to the wound, the foundling child clinging to her other side, very much alive and very much unharmed because Eira had made certain of it before making any certain decision about herself. He looked at the blood on the stone. He understood, with the specific horror of timing arriving exactly wrong, that the law he had hesitated to challenge had just nearly cost her life in the same physical location where his hesitation had first cost her dignity. He knelt beside her and asked what she needed. She told him to find the foundling's parents, if any could be found, and if not, to see the child fed and warmed before anything else. He went. When he returned, she had already bound her own wound with cloth torn from her sleeve, having decided that waiting for a healer was a lower priority than making sure the child stopped shaking. He looked at her competence in the aftermath of violence and understood something further about who he had married, separate from bloodline, separate from the trial, separate from anything the council had ever measured. Lady Saren came to Eira the following morning, without her clan colors, dressed plainly enough that she might have passed for a temple servant. She said she had learned something she could no longer carry alone. Theric had prepared her contract as replacement Luna before the first trial had even taken place, drafted, sealed, and ready to be presented the moment Caelan's bond to Eira could be declared void. Saren had believed, when she agreed to the arrangement, that she was preserving order against an unknown and possibly dangerous bloodline, she said. I understand now that Eira was never the danger. She was the obstacle to the clans keeping control they had no right to keep. She agreed to testify. That same week, the mountain itself began to register its objection to the unresolved trial. Small avalanches struck the lower clan villages, nothing catastrophic but unmistakable in their timing. Several of the lesser stone wolves throughout the mountain's older shrines developed hairline cracks overnight. The mountain was rejecting a false oath sitting unresolved at its center, and everyone with any sensitivity to old law understood exactly what that meant. Theric, cornered by the mountain's own response, declared a second trial. Caelan would enter again, this time with Saren formally presented as Luna, and would publicly reject Eira's claim as keeper. If he refused, the clans would name him oathless and void his crown entirely. He had until dawn to decide. At dawn, the clans gathered before the temple in numbers larger than the first trial had drawn, word of the mountain's unrest having spread through every village within reach. Stood near the gate, dressed as replacement Luna, her expression carrying none of the satisfaction such a moment should have held for. Someone about to be crowned. Eira stood outside the gate again, in the same place she had stood before. Except this time she had not come to wait passively for whatever decision men inside might reach. She carried the first den cloth. She carried a list, written in her own hand, of every nameless child she had found in the temple's older records. Theric told Caelan to enter with Saren and complete the trial as planned. Caelan looked at the gate. He looked at the exact spot in the snow where he had left Eira standing. Alone, 3 days earlier, he removed his crown. He set it on the ground. He walked to Eira instead, and knelt before the temple gate in front of every clan house and every witness the mountain could gather. He said, I entered as king and left as a man who had forgotten the first pack. The crowd did not move. I left my Luna outside because the law told me blood mattered more than oath. He looked up at the gate, then at Eira. I will not pass a trial that requires me to abandon the one the mountain remembers. Eira placed her hand on the gate. This time she did not whisper. She spoke as keeper, with a voice that carried further than her own physical strength should have allowed. The mountain opened. The first den archive rose from beneath the temple. The carved chamber Eira had found in darkness now visible to every witness gathered in daylight. Oath stones glowing with names that filled the air above the crowd like smoke given shape and memory. Most of the names carried no clan affiliation at all. The stone wolves turned toward the assembled noble houses. They showed, through some method that bypassed ordinary sight and arrived directly in the mind of every witness present, the things the clans had spent generations ensuring no one would see. Orphans denied names across 6 generations, foundlings barred from trial voice, clanless mates hidden from public record. First den documentation deliberately burned. Theric's own orders, given 3 nights earlier, to have Eira killed in the tunnels. The replacement Luna contract, dated and sealed before the first trial had even begun. Around the crowd, faces changed as the images passed through them. Some noble representatives looked at their own boots. unwilling to meet the eyes of the servants and foundlings now standing among them as equal witnesses for the first time in the temple's recorded history. One elderly clan matron, who had voted for Eira's exclusion at the original council session, was seen to press a hand to her mouth and turn away entirely, recognizing among the projected names a child her own house had quietly turned away 2 generations earlier. The crowd saw all of it. Saren stepped forward and removed her ceremonial veil before anyone called on her to speak. She confirmed what the stone wolves had shown, that Theric had prepared her crowning before Eira's bloodline had even been formally questioned. Because the question had never actually been about bloodline, it had been about control. The clans feared Eira, she said, because if the first den returned to memory, noble blood would no longer be the only path to belonging. Theric argued that the mountain itself would collapse into chaos without clear bloodline order. Arkan's voice answered from the temple depths, carrying the particular finality of something far older than the argument being made against it. The mountain stood before your names. Theric was stripped of council authority on the spot and arrested by clan guards who, Eira noted, moved without hesitation the moment the choice was made clear to them. The court expected Eira to step forward and complete the trial beside Caelan immediately. The crisis resolved, the crown secured. The story concluded in the manner such stories were traditionally expected to conclude. She did not move. She said, "I will not be proof that one orphan can be accepted while the law keeps the rest outside." She looked at the assembled clans. "I demand the law change before I become its exception." Caelan, still kneeling, did not ask her to reconsider. He understood finally and completely that her refusal was not punishment. It was the actual trial, the one the stone wolves had been waiting 500 years to see a king pass. The formal trial resumed only after Caelan agreed, before the full council and the watching mountain, to open the first den archive permanently and begin the work of rewriting clan blood law. Eira did not stand beside him to complete the ceremony. She stood at the gate with the foundling children who had gathered, drawn by word of what was happening, uncertain whether they were welcome but unwilling to stay away. Caelan stood below her rather than beside her, which felt, to both of them, like the correct arrangement for this particular moment. The stone wolves bowed only when the first of those foundling children was given a pack name without requiring a noble sponsor. The bow that followed carried none of the violent uncertainty of the first trial. It was simple, full, and complete. The new clan blood law took the better part of 2 months to draft properly, with input required from temple witnesses as well as clan representatives for the first time in the mountain's recorded history. Orphans and foundlings could receive pack names without noble sponsorship. Temple-raised wolves gained standing to speak in sacred trials. Lunas no longer required traceable bloodline for recognition. Clanless mates could not be hidden from public oath records. The first den archive became permanent public record, housed beneath the temple where it had always been, but no longer sealed from those it had been built to remember. Every child found on mountain ground gained automatic pack protection regardless of parentage. Noble clans lost sole control over temple records. Exile based on unverified bloodline was formally forbidden. Sacred trials required shelter witnesses alongside clan witnesses going forward. Caelan asked Eira if she would now enter the temple with him to formally complete what the trial had begun. She said, "I will enter when the children who would have been left outside can enter before me." He accepted this without argument, which she recognized as further evidence that something in him had actually changed rather than simply complied. The first public naming ceremony under the new law took place 3 weeks later. A foundling girl, perhaps 5 years old, was brought to the temple gate by the same kind of priestess who had once raised Eira under far less certain terms. Under the old law, she would have waited indefinitely for a sponsor who might never appear. Eira knelt before the child, not before the gathered clans, before the child. Caelan spoke the new oath, the words drafted over the previous 2 months by people who had never before been permitted input into temple ceremony. The child received her pack name. The stone wolves bowed, fully and without the uncertainty that had marked the first trial. Only then did Eira rise and step through the temple gate herself. For the first time since the morning, Caelan had left her outside it. Caelan reached for her hand as they walked through together, then stopped himself and simply asked, with his hand open between them, rather than taking hers without permission. She allowed him to walk beside her. When he began, out of old habit, to move slightly ahead, she said, "Beside the oath or outside it?" He stepped back into place. "Beside," he said. No instant forgiveness passed between them in that moment. No mate mark flared. No wedding renewal followed. Only the beginning of something built on law that had actually changed, walked at a pace that matched rather than led. 1 year later, the mountain temple had become home to a constantly growing First Den archive. With new names added as old records continued to surface from generations of deliberate erasure. Some of those names belonged to people still living, who came forward once it became clear the temple would not punish them for the circumstances of their birth. Some belonged to people long dead, whose descendants finally learned why certain family lines had simply stopped appearing in clan records. Generations ago, orphans and foundlings throughout the Mountain Kingdom were registered as pack children with full standing. Many of them for the first time in their family's recorded history. Caelan trained a new generation of shelter witnesses, women and men drawn from temple service rather than noble houses, to ensure sacred trials going forward would never again lack a voice for those without clan name. Saren worked alongside reformed clan archivists, helping expose the last of the falsified records that had erased First Den history from official memory. Caelan ruled with both temple and clan oversight, a structure that frustrated the old noble houses considerably, and seemed, to everyone else, like the first genuinely stable arrangement the Mountain Kingdom had held in generations. Eira served as keeper of the First Den, and as Luna only by her own continued and freely given consent, a distinction the new law had made explicit rather than assumed. During a winter storm severe enough to close the lower mountain passes, a boy with no clan name arrived at the temple gate seeking shelter, exactly the kind of arrival that the old law would have left waiting outside until a sponsor could be located or, more likely, until the weather decided the question for him. The new law required no such waiting. Eira stood inside the gate as it opened. Caelan stood beside her, not ahead. The stone wolves lowered their heads in the simple, settled bow that had become ordinary rather than miraculous in the month since the trial. Eira looked at the boy, snow-covered and shivering and uncertain whether he was actually welcome. She said, "The mountain does not ask who abandoned you. It asks who will shelter you now." The Alpha King left his Luna outside the mountain temple because she had no clan name, but the stone wolves bowed to her instead, because the mountain remembered the first oath. A pack belongs not to those who inherit it, but to those who shelter the ones left at the gate.